Chapter 2. About halfway between West Egg and New York, the motor road hastily joins the railroad and runs alongside it for a quarter of a mile so as to skirt around, so as to shrink away from a certain desolate area of land. This is a valley of ashes. A fantastic farm where ashes grow like ridges and wheat into ridges and hills and grotesque gardens, where ashes take the shape of houses and chimneys and rising smoke, and with transcendent effort into the form of ash-gray men who move dimly and already crumbling through the powdery air. Occasionally a line of grey cars crawls along an invisible track, lets out a ghastly creak, and comes to rest, and immediately the ash-grey men swarm up with leaden spades and stir up an impenetrable cloud which screens their obscure operation from your sight. The Valley of Ashes is bounded on one side by a small foul river, and when the drawbridge is up to let barges pass, passengers in the waiting trains can stare at the dismal scene for up to half an hour. There's always a pause here of at least a minute, and it's because of this that I first met Tom Buchanan's mistress. The fact that he had one was insisted upon wherever he was known. His acquaintances resented the fact that he strolled into popular cafes with her, and leaving her at a table, sauntered about chatting with whomsoever he knew. Though I was curious to see her, I had no desire to meet her, but I did. I was taking the train with Tom up to New York one afternoon when we stopped at the ash heap, and taking me by the elbow, literally forced me from the car. "We're getting off," he said. "I want you to meet my girl." I think he'd tanked up a good deal at luncheon, and his determination to have my company bordered on violence. I followed him over a low, whitewashed railroad fence, and we walked back along the road for a quarter of a mile, for 100 yards or so. Oh, missed one whole section. But above the grey land, stop it. But above the grey land and the spasms of bleak dust, one perceived after a moment the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. The eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg are blue and gigantic. The retinas are 1 yard high. And they look out of no face, but instead out of a pair of enormous yellow spectacles. Which pass over a non-existent nose. Evidently some wild wag of an oculist had set them there to fatten his practice in the borough of Queens, and then sank down himself into eternal blindness, or else forgot them and moved away. But his eyes, dulled a little after many paintless days of sun and rain, brood on over the solemn dumping ground. The River of Ashes is bounded on one side by a small foul river. When the drawbridge is up to let barges through, passengers in the waiting train can stare at the dismal scene for up to half an hour. There's always a pause here of at least a minute. It's because of this that I first met Tom Buchanan's mistress. The fact that he had one was insisted upon wherever he was known. His acquaintances resented the fact that he came into popular cafes with her, and leaving her at a table, sauntered about chatting with whomsoever he knew. Though I was curious to see her, I had no desire to meet her, but I did. Taking the train with Tom up to New York one afternoon, When we stopped by the ash heap, he, taking me by the elbow, literally forced me from the car. "We're getting off," he said. "I want you to meet my girl." I suspect he tanked up a good deal at luncheon in his determination to have my company bordered on violence. I followed him over a low, whitewashed railroad fence, and walked back along the road, 100 yards or so, under the persistent watch of Dr. Eckelberg. Under Dr. Eckelberg's persistent watch. The only building visible was a small square of yellow brick sitting on the edge of the wasteland. A sort of compact Main Street ministering gate and contiguous to absolutely nothing. One of the stores it contained was for lease, and another was an all-night restaurant approached by a trail of ashes. And the third was a garage. Repairs, George B. Wilson, cars bought and sold. And I followed Tom inside. The inside was unprosperous and bare. The only car visible was the dust-covered wreck of a Ford which crouched in a dim corner. It had occurred to me that this shadow of a garage must be a blind, and that sumptuous and romantic apartments were concealed overhead, when the proprietor himself appeared in the doorway of an office, wiping his hands on a piece of waste. He was a blond, spiritless man, anemic and faintly handsome. When he saw us, a damp gleam of hope leapt into his light blue eyes. "Hello, Wilson. Old man," said Tom jovially, slapping him on the shoulder. "How's business?" "I can't complain," said Wilson unconvincingly. "When are you going to sell me that car?" "Next week," Tom said. "Next week," said Tom. "I've got my man working on it now." "Works pretty slow, don't he?" "No," said Tom coldly. "And if you feel that way about it, maybe I'd better sell the car somewhere else after all." "I didn't mean that," said Wilson quickly. His voice trailed off, and Tom looked impatiently around the garage. The figure of a woman blocked out the light from the office door. She was in her middle 30s, faintly stout, but she carried her flesh sensuously, as some women can. Carried her flesh sensuously, as some women can. Her face, above a dress of blue-spotted crepe de Chine, contained no gleam, no facet or gleam of beauty, but there was an immediately perceptible vitality about her, as if the nerves of her body were continually smoldering. She wet her lips and she smiled slowly. Smiling slowly, she moved through her husband as if he were a ghost, and shook hands with Tom, looking him flush in the eye. Without turning, she spoke to her husband in a soft, coarse voice. Get some chairs, why don't you, so someone can sit down. Oh, sure, said Wilson, and went off in the direction of the office, mingling immediately with the cement color of the walls. A white ashen dust veiled his dark suit and his hair as it veiled everything in the vicinity, except his wife, who moved close to Tom. I want to see you, he said. Get on the next train. She nodded and moved away from him just as Wilson reappeared holding two chairs. We waited for her down the road and out of sight. Waited for her down the road and out of sight, watching a gray, scrawny Italian child. It was near the 4th of July, and we watched a gray, scrawny Italian child setting torpedoes along the railroad. Awful place, isn't it? Said Tom, exchanging a frown with Dr. Eckelberg. Terrible, I said. It does her good to get away. Doesn't her husband mind? Wilson? He thinks she goes to visit her sister in New York. He's so dumb he doesn't know he's alive. And so Tom, his mistress, and I went together on the train to New York. Well, not exactly together. Mrs. Wilson sat discreetly in the next car. Tom deferred that much to the sensibilities of those West Eggers who might be on the train. Tom deferred that much to the sensibility of those East Eggers that might be on the train. When we got to New York, she had changed her dress to a brown fitted muslin which clung to her hips as Tom helped her down to the platform in New York. At the newsstand, she bought a copy of the Town Tattle and Broadway and this small scandal magazine of Broadway at the station drugstore, she bought some lotion and a small perfume. We upstairs in the there's something about how they move from the mass of the station to the echoing drive outside. And she let 4 taxicabs drive away before selecting a new one. Gray in color with lavender upholstery. And in this we moved from the mass of the station station to the bustling street. Then turning sharply from the window, tapping on the glass. She says, "Wait, I want to get one of those dogs. They're a nice thing to have for the apartment. They're a nice thing to have, a dog." We backed up to an old man who bore an absurd resemblance to John D. Rockefeller, slung from a basket around his neck. A dozen or so very recent puppies of an indeterminate breed. "What kind are they?" she inquired as he came to the taxi window. "All kinds. What kind do you want, lady?" "I'd like to get one of those police dogs." "I don't suppose you have that kind." He looked doubtfully into the basket, plunged in a hand, and pulled one out by the neck. "That's no police dog," said Tom. "It's not a police dog. It's not exactly a police dog," said the man doubtfully. "It's more of an Airedale." The Airedale, "I think it's cute," said Mrs. Wilson. The Airedale, evidently there was some Airedale concerned in it somewhere, though its paws were shockingly white, changed hands, and it cost $10, and Tom said, "Here's your money, go buy 10 more dogs with it." And they drove over to 5th Avenue, and it's pastoral, and "Hold on," I said, "I have to leave you here." "No, you don't," said Tom. Myrtle will be hurt if you don't come up to the apartment. Myrtle will be hurt if you don't come up to the... Besides, Myrtle will be hurt if you don't come up to the apartment. murder will be heard if you don't go into the apartment. And she says, yeah, I'll telephone my sister. She's said to be quite lovely by people who ought to know. Said to be quite lovely by people who ought to know. They arrive at one slice in a cake of apartment houses, and she looks around with triumphant homecoming. In the elevator, Miss Wilson says she's going to have the McKees come up, and missed the thing where she's first concerned with the dog. She's first concerned with the dog, to get in the elevator. A reluctant elevator boy is sent out. A reluctant elevator boy is sent out for a box full of straw and a saucer of milk, to which he on his own initiative added tin of large hard dog biscuits, one of which sat apathetically decomposing in a saucer of milk all afternoon. And then there's some stuff about how her apartment furniture's too big. This is a small living room, a small bedroom, and a bathroom. The living room is crammed to the doors. There's furniture too large for it. With tapestried furniture entirely too large for it. So to move about was to continually stumble over images of ladies swinging in the gardens of Versailles. And there's one picture, an overlarge picture, evidently a hen, an over-enlarged photograph, evidently a hen sitting on a rock. But looked at from a distance, the hen resolved itself into a bonnet, and the countenance of a startled woman beamed down into the room. Meanwhile, Tom got a bottle of whiskey from there were old copies of the Town Tattle and Broadway Scandal magazines on the table, and a copy of Simon Called Peter. Meanwhile, Tom got a bottle of whiskey from a locked bureau door. I've been drunk just twice in my life, and the second time was that afternoon, so everything that happened had a dim, hazy cast over it, although until 8 o'clock, the apartment was full of cheerful sun. Sitting on Tom's lap, Mrs. Wilson telephoned, called up several people on the telephone. And then there were no cigarettes. So I went out to buy some from the drugstore on the corner. When I returned, Tom and Mrs. Wilson, when I returned they had both disappeared. So I sat down discreetly in the living room and read a chapter of Simon Called Peter. Either it was terrible stuff or the whiskey had distorted things because it made no sense to me. It made no sense to me. Just as Tom and Myrtle, after our first drink, Miss Wilson and I called each other by our first names, reappeared, guests began arriving at the apartment door. Company commenced arriving at the apartment door. And that's it. That's all I've got.